Extract 10. Vincent Frankenstein. Date 1800s. It is done, but at an unexpected cost. I have been injured badly and lost an arm. Yet, I almost lost everything in this wild excursion. I have been in bed for days as we fly. Horrific nightmares plague me both while asleep and awake. The torment of my new disability has been all-consuming. When I wake, I feel my arm, but then I look to it and it is gone, and I balk in horror and scream into my pillow. We rescued Anne, and she has been a great comfort during this difficult time. She refused to leave my side until she knew I was well enough. I always try to convince them I am well, by being strong when with them, but when alone I feel my mind may fracture from all that I have endured and witnessed. The horrors weigh so heavy on my soul that it feels like I'm caught in a net of darkness that is dragging me to the bottom of some tragic ocean of despair and turmoil. Perhaps writing once again might give me back my strength of mind. So I shall now recall all that has happened since my last entry. If I can just hold myself together until I'm back with Mary, I know her strength and comfort will help me heal. But I must distract myself. I will write what happened, but with the aching and tiredness I feel, I will write what I can and rest when I need to. After John called me back to the deck, I went to meet him and felt the ship start to descend. I'm taking the ship a mile out of town, he said. I have circled a couple of times, and fortunately they're still there and haven't moved on. We landed a mile out and made our way to the village with Connor's guns. Each of us had a rifle, I the freeze rifle and John the lightning. John also carried the magnetic pulse pistol, while I had spare charges for the rifles in a bag over my shoulder. We snuck in under the cover of darkness, trying to stay clear of any human women. We didn't want to kill if we could avoid it. Our target was the undead, the matriarch and her daughters, and then we would rescue the babies and find Anne. We made our way to the opposite side of the house, where the matriarch and her daughters lived. There were piles and piles of dead men at different stages of decay sprawled gruesomely all around the house, plus a massive pyramid-shaped pile to the left of the house. The mixture of what I saw and the sudden flare of rotting flesh in my nose made me gag several times. I was nearly sick, but managed to stop myself. Both John and I hid while we tried to adapt. After a few minutes of slow, eye-watering breathing, the smell was only just bearable. I looked over to the house again, and beyond the dead bodies, to where the women were sitting outside the house. I don't know how they could withstand the smell, but I guess they had grown accustomed to the foul stench of putrefying flesh. There was no sign of the matriarch and her daughters. We need a distraction, John whispered to me as we crouched in our place of concealment. Wait here. He then darted off, cradling the lightning rifle as I waited nervously and shook with fear. But I breathed deep several times to calm myself. I took off the pack and laid it to my side, leaving it open so we could get a new charge with speed and ease. My gaze then darted between the house and the direction in which John had disappeared. After several minutes, dark but noticeable smoke began to rise from where he had been. As I noticed the smoke, I heard swift and light footsteps approaching, and to my relief it was John, with a grim smile on his face. That should work. And he was right. Shouts and calls came from the direction of the smoke, and the women at the house gathered to look. It wasn't long before the matriarch appeared through the enlarged doorway and barked an order. All but 3 of the guards left the house to investigate. With the matriarch outside, some of the dead men began to move, writhe, and then rise. A few of them were so old they had no flesh and were only bones, and with others the flesh fell off their bones as they moved, and some were killed recently and had knife marks, twisted heads, missing arms, or a combination of partial dismemberment. Keep an eye on the dead, John whispered, and freeze them if they come near. Without another moment's delay, he then lined up a shot at the matriarch and pulled the trigger. The bright flash of lightning from John's rifle momentarily connected him and the house, but then the light was gone. Where the connection was made, a charred and glowing hole was as obvious as the moon on a cloudless night. The matriarch turned in shock. Then, on seeing the hole, she threw herself through the enlarged doorway, smashing the door into splinters. John's second shot missed her by inches, and the woman started to grab for weapons. They knew where we were now. John tried to line up another shot, but before he could, the three women were coming towards us, blocking his line of fire. In that moment's delay, there came a blood-chilling roar, and the matriarch bounded back out of the house. "Stay with the children," she roared, nearly bowling the three women over as she pushed past them. They managed to scramble to the left and right to clear a path. I half watched the matriarch and half watched the undead men. Some had fallen back to the earth when she entered the house, but with her sudden return they began to animate. I held my rifle as steady as I could, and readied myself to either shoot the matriarch or the undead men. John repositioned himself. He tried to follow the matriarch with his weapon, as she didn't come straight at us. Instead, she threw herself amongst the pile of dead men. A grotesque ripple of movement then spread from the pile, and the dead men rolled off one another, forming several rows in front of the matriarch, who I could just see crouching behind them all. "Mother!" came the barely comprehensible groans from the dead men as they began to lumber towards us, some slipping on the patches of blood-soaked earth. Other men joined the ranks as the matriarch moved forward. Bewildered, I failed to act, but suddenly John fired a bolt of his rifle, and not knowing what else to do, I pointed and fired in the same direction. Between our shots, we burned apart and froze the creatures closest to us. We shot again, and the first row was in pieces, seemingly inanimate at last. I shot again and again, taking down more with each shot. In my panic, I hadn't noticed John had stopped firing. Then suddenly a ripple tore through the air, and about 50 of the dead men fell down. The amount of corpses began to pile up, and the animated dead scrambled over their brothers. In that moment I gained hope. We were holding them back. But from the piles of bodies emerged the matriarch, limbs, torsos, heads, and the blood of the dead men spraying in all directions. John shot the magnetic pulse pistol, and it hit the matriarch. Her roar was cut short, and she yelped in pain, clutching her head, but continued on towards us. I froze in terror, a silent scream smothering my hope, but fortunately my fingers locked on the gun. I pulled the trigger, falling back as I gasped. My shot hit her, and she fell stiffly, ice spreading across her unnatural figure. I watched as she came down towards John. He fell back too, and crossed his arms over his face, and kicked out his legs, his leather coat whipping backwards. The frozen matriarch hit his boots in one big block of ice, and she fell to the side of a flood. I scrambled quickly to my feet, and remembering the oncoming dead, I turned. To my relief, with the matriarch incapacitated, they had all collapsed. I turned back to John as he was getting to his feet and wincing. "Ah, you are right," I asked breathlessly. "My legs have been jarred, but I'm a tough man to crack." With a wink, he dusted himself off. We both looked over at the frozen matriarch and sighed in unison with relief. Suddenly screams from the house brought us out of our premature celebration. We saw no one at the front of the house. The three women who had been on guard there were gone. "Look, the window," John said, and I saw a silhouette of one of the daughters in an upstairs window, and then she was gone. "Time for the next round of the fight," he added. I took a deep breath and saw John check his rifle, prompting me to check the freeze rifle. Both charges were depleted, so we replaced them. As much as I don't want to, we're going to have to leave the bag and magnetic pulse pistol here. We need to be light and able to move in the confines of the house. The full charges will be enough, though. "If you're sure," I replied. He just nodded, hefted the rifle, and made for the house, moving around the piled and scattered bodies littering the ground. I followed at half a step behind him. We faced no confrontation as we took each step up to the porch and front door. My senses were alert, and adrenaline fueled me onwards, pounding hot through my veins like lava. At the door, John stood to the left of the frame and peered diagonally into the house. I did the same from the opposite side, and saw no sign of anyone. But it was dark, and deep shadows reached out towards us. John looked at me expectantly. "Nothing I can see," I whispered. "Guard the right, then, and I'll take the left and the stairs going up to the first landing. Go." He then moved, and I followed, holding the freeze rifle ready for an attack. The moment we crossed the threshold, echoing screams vibrated from every direction. Not a moment later, two giant figures appeared from dark doorways that led to opposite rooms. Emily and Charlotte caught us by surprise, and shamefully I dropped my weapon in fright. John managed to let a wild shot out, which burned through his assailant's arm. Charlotte screamed in agony as John's wild cut ripped through her arm at the shoulder. The severed limb fell to the floor, and Charlotte screamed, "Save me!" as Emily stopped her train-like approach for a moment. Seeing what had happened, she took cruel inspiration and followed the last few steps towards me. I had no time to react, and she clutched me in her vice-like grip. She had one hand on my neck and the other just above my elbow. She then pulled with her incredible strength, and my mind exploded in pain and realization. It was too much, and the last thing I remembered was prying open my eyes and trying to strain against the agonizing tension on my shoulder. With my eyes a crack open, I saw a massive blur appear to my left and fling itself at Emily. This was the last thing I saw before blacking out. What happened after this has been recalled to me by John. It was Anne who had been the blur I saw as I fainted. She had seen the burning stable John had used for a distraction from her hiding place in the forest a few miles away up the rolling knolls. Anne guessed it was us, and swiftly came to investigate, arriving just in time to tackle Emily. She stopped Emily killing me. With Emily pinned by Anne, John swiftly turned the power up on the lightning rifle and shot straight at Charlotte, leaving a massive hole in her chest. She slumped to the ground, dead. With no more delay, he darted over to me, lined the rifle up, and shot down towards my gaping shoulder, hoping to cauterize it. The heat did burn the flesh and nerves on my shoulder and stop the blood from gushing out any more. John bent down and looked briefly, hoping it was enough to save me. He then watched as Anne strangled the last of the life out of Emily. "Take Vincent," he said once Emily was still. He saw Anne's trembling hands and knew he had to distract her before remorse crept in. "Take Vincent," he repeated. It worked. She turned to see him and quickly picked me up in her arms. "We need to go upstairs and find the children." John led the way. As suspected, there were several women with the children, and he told them of the death of the matriarch and 2 daughters. One woman nearly charged at John in a rage of anger, but he held up the rifle and she stopped. "You may leave and tell all the others to do the same," John told them. "What you have fought for is obtainable, but it's how you do something, not what you do, that you must focus on. The horrors and bloodshed you have been part of sickens me, but you have one last chance. With the matriarch gone, you have no one to fuel your brutality now. Seek for fairness with men, but in a more constructive way. Destruction is not the answer here. This is my advice to you. Now go," he shouted. They listened, and with his order they left in a hurry, stealing glances back at Anne and the 2 babies who lay in large, garishly painted cots. With this done, John seemed satisfied there would be no more trouble. He thanked Anne for her return and took her hand in his, telling her she had saved us all. With this done, they gently set me down and approached the cots to look at the baby boy and girl. Despite all the commotion, the children slept the deep sleep of innocence, both with tufts of jet black hair, and though their skin was an off dark yellow pigment with like their kin, it had baby fatness which softened the harshness. "I will give you a world to live in happiness," John murmured, lightly stroking the cheek of the little girl and glancing up at Anne with a smile. "Thank you for keeping your promise," Anne replied. "I will raise them with love and peace, where no prejudice will harden their hearts. We have to get Vincent back to my Zeppelin. He needs proper care. I have medication which will take away the pain and guarantee no infections. It's shameful that I let this happen, but sometimes it cannot be helped. I hope he can forgive me." "I'm sure he will," Anne comforted. "If he is half the man you told me he is, he will not count you responsible." "We'll have to wait and see," John replied as he slung the rifle around his back and scooped my unconscious body in his arms. "Can you manage the babies?" "I can," Anne replied. He then took me back to the Zeppelin, leaving the freeze rifle on the ground floor of the house. The children woke when Anne carried them, but they made no sound of discomfort. "They are very mild-tempered," Anne said. "I'm glad. It makes this a whole lot easier," John replied. As they walked briskly to the Zeppelin, they saw many women with torches and bags coming and going, eyeing them reproachfully and bitterly before carrying on their way. Many were walking away from the town, and the word of how the uprising had failed must have spread quickly. When they got to the Zeppelin, John made sure I was in the comfort of my bed and given medicine, and the babies were settled in John's room. He then returned to the town and let the Zeppelin rise so no one could catch us unawares, and for added security, he made the ship invisible to all on the ground. Once he recovered the weapons and charges, and disintegrated the flesh and bone of the matriarch, Emily and Charlotte, he checked the whole town to make sure it was empty. When satisfied, he then returned. From the deck he began using the lightning rifle on a low setting to blast the houses, and watch the wood ignite and fire spread. It wasn't long before the whole place was alight, and all the corpses caught in the spreading fire. That should do it, John said to himself on the deck, and then walked to the helm to steer the ship on a course away from the desolation. And that is John's account to me of what happened. The next thing I remembered was waking from a dream that felt like it had lasted decades, but had not rested me at all. My body ached all over, and when I stirred, I remembered and felt the horrors of what had happened at the house. Or rather, I didn't feel. I went to move my arm and cried out in agony at my loss. I will not tell you the anguish and melancholy feelings I had in those first days, trying to adjust to my disfigurement. It wasn't long after that initial awakening that I met Anne properly for the first time. It shames me, but in my self-pity I struggled to find the desire to talk to her, or even John. But after more sleep, food, and their patience, I was able to conduct myself with better decorum. I remembered the reason of my mission, and how we had saved Anne and the babies, the innocent babies, who now had a chance of a free and loving life, away from bitterness and prejudice. This, plus knowing Mary would want me to be strong, gave me the focus to be a friend, and see the positives as much as I was able to in my pain. I also have comfort that my father's mistakes have been rectified, and the malicious matriarch and her degenerated daughters have been snuffed out to no longer be a torment on all humanity. Now Mary and I can return to our goals to unite all those seeking for an equal companionship of love and respect between men and women in all aspects of life. Before this can continue, however, we need to take Anne and the babies to their new home. It has been an honour to get to know Anne in this brief time, and her beautiful nature reassures me that John and I have made the right choices. In time I hope I will learn to accept the loss of my arm as a cost worth paying, but it will be hard. Anne's lovely nature has shone through in her desire to still be tied to the human race and call me family. She could easily shun us for the wrongs we have committed. In a beautiful gesture of love, she has called the babies Mary and Vincent, so they will remember us, and I feel honoured for such a connection to them.